The smell of fried food and the dull hum of conversations swirled around her as Alice sat alone at her usual spot in the mall's food court. She was a creature of habit, often stopping by for a quick lunch in between her shifts at the nearby bookstore. The familiar bustle of shoppers, the clinking of utensils, and the occasional whir of a blender blended into the background as she scrolled through her phone, trying to ignore the strange sensation creeping up her spine. It was on her third or fourth bite of her sandwich when she first noticed him. At first, it seemed like nothing, just a man sitting a few tables away, quietly sipping his coffee and flipping through a magazine. But something about his presence felt wrong. He was too still, too focused. She glanced up, catching his eyes for a split second. He quickly looked down at his magazine, pretending to be engrossed in the pages. Alice tried to shake off the uneasy feeling. She reasoned with herself that it was nothing, just some random guy. She went back to her phone, finishing her sandwich with a sense of forced calm. But as she stood to leave, her peripheral vision caught a glimpse of the man once more. His eyes were on her again, only this time he didn't bother looking away. A cold shiver ran through her. Over the next few weeks, she began to notice him more frequently. It wasn't every time she visited the mall, but enough to plant a seed of doubt in her mind. Sometimes he sat in the same spot, other times he positioned himself at different tables. Always alone. Always watching. At first, she thought it was just her mind playing tricks. Maybe it was a coincidence. A fluke. But the pattern became undeniable. One Saturday afternoon, after a long week of work, Alice found herself back at the mall. She ordered her usual meal and sat at her regular table, instinctively scanning the area. Her heart skipped a beat when she spotted him again, sitting a few tables away. He was staring, no magazine, no coffee this time, just staring at her, expressionless. Panic bubbled up inside her chest, but she forced herself to eat, refusing to let fear dictate her actions. As she finished, Alice resolved to confront him. Maybe he was harmless, or maybe it was some sort of misunderstanding. She stood, gathering her courage and her belongings, but when she turned back to where he had been sitting, the chair was empty. He was gone. Her heart pounded in her ears as she looked around the food court. People bustled about, oblivious to the silent tension building in her chest. She could feel his presence lingering, like the residue of a nightmare. That night, as Alice lay in bed, she couldn't shake the image of his face from her mind. The way his eyes had locked onto hers. The eerie stillness of his body. It wasn't just coincidence anymore, it was deliberate. She could feel it. And as she drifted off into a restless sleep, one thought haunted her. He was watching. Alice woke up the next morning with a lingering sense of unease. The air in her small apartment felt thick, almost suffocating, as though the shadows themselves had grown longer overnight. She pushed the feeling aside, convincing herself that the man from the food court was nothing more than a coincidence, a creepy, unsettling coincidence, but harmless nonetheless. As the days went on, she tried to resume her routine. Work, groceries, the occasional coffee with friends. But no matter what she did, the sensation that she was being watched seemed to cling to her. Every time she entered the mall, her heart raced. Her eyes darted around the food court, scanning every table for that familiar face. Some days, he was there. Other days, he was nowhere to be seen, yet the feeling of being observed persisted, like a phantom presence lurking just out of sight. Then, one afternoon, the escalation began. Alice had just finished her shift at the bookstore and decided to swing by the mall for a quick bite. She told herself that avoiding the food court would only feed her paranoia, so she walked in, determined to reclaim her sense of normalcy. She found an empty table near the window, far enough from where she usually sat, and began eating her salad, trying to relax. But within minutes, she spotted him again. This time, he was sitting closer, much closer. He had chosen a table only a few feet away from hers, and once again, he was staring. His dark eyes fixed on her as though waiting for something. Her pulse quickened, and her hands trembled slightly as she tried to continue eating, forcing herself to ignore him. But she couldn't. His gaze was too intense, too deliberate. Suddenly, he stood up. Alice's breath hitched as she watched him rise from his seat, her mind racing. Was he coming toward her? She fought the urge to bolt, reminding herself that this was a public place, filled with people. Nothing could happen here. Yet the man made no move in her direction. Instead, he turned and walked toward the exit, his figure disappearing into the crowd. Relief washed over her, but it was short-lived. When she looked down at her tray, she noticed something that hadn't been there before, a small, folded piece of paper. Her stomach churned. With shaking hands, she unfolded the note. The words were written in neat, deliberate handwriting, and they sent a chill down her spine. "You can't hide forever." Her heart pounded in her chest. She scanned the room, hoping to catch a glimpse of him, but he was gone. The mall felt suddenly claustrophobic, as if the walls were closing in around her. She shoved the note into her bag, grabbed her belongings, and rushed out of the food court without a second glance. The walk to her car was a blur. She could feel eyes on her the entire time, the weight of someone's gaze pressing down on her like a suffocating blanket. By the time she reached her car, she was nearly sprinting. She fumbled with her keys, her hands slick with sweat, and finally managed to unlock the door. She threw herself into the driver's seat, locking the doors behind her. For several minutes, she just sat there, her breath coming in short, ragged gasps. She clutched the steering wheel, staring at the entrance to the mall, half expecting him to emerge from the shadows. But no one came. After what felt like an eternity, Alice started the car and drove home, her knuckles white as she gripped the wheel. That night, sleep was impossible. Every creak of the apartment, every gust of wind outside her window made her jump. She checked her door locks 3 times before finally collapsing onto her couch, too wired to sleep but too exhausted to stay awake. The note burned in the back of her mind. The next morning, Alice was determined to take control. She wouldn't let this stranger terrorize her. She went to the police, hoping they would take her seriously. The officer at the desk listened politely as she explained everything, the repeated sightings, the note, the feeling of being followed. But when she finished, all she got was a sympathetic smile and a half-hearted assurance that they would keep an eye out. "Ma'am, it could just be someone messing with you," the officer said, leaning back in his chair. "It happens, especially in crowded places like the mall. Just be vigilant and report anything suspicious. We'll look into it." Alice left the station feeling more alone than ever. The authorities wouldn't help. She was on her own. But as she drove home, a creeping sense of dread settled over her. She couldn't shake the feeling that this was far from over. The man wasn't just watching her. He was waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Alice began avoiding the mall entirely. The thought of returning to that food court, of seeing him sitting there, staring, was too much to bear. Instead, she stuck to her apartment, her cozy one-bedroom sanctuary that now felt more like a prison. She stayed in as much as possible, hoping that putting physical distance between herself and the mall would ease her anxiety. But deep down, she knew it wouldn't stop him. The note had changed everything. It wasn't a coincidence or a misunderstanding anymore. This was deliberate, calculated. And whoever he wasn't going to stop. The days passed in a blur, but the feeling of being watched never left. Alice began to notice small, unsettling details, like the way her curtains, which she always left drawn at night, seemed slightly parted in the mornings. Or how her front door, which she always locked religiously, sometimes felt like it had been disturbed. At first, she dismissed these thoughts as paranoia, the natural consequence of living in constant fear. But each new detail chipped away at her resolve. One night, Alice was sitting on her couch, watching TV, when her phone buzzed. It was an unknown number. Her heart rate quickened as she stared at the screen, debating whether to answer. Against her better judgment, she picked up the call, pressing the phone to her ear. "Hello?" There was silence on the other end, save for the faint sound of breathing. "Who is this?" Alice demanded, her voice shaking. The breathing stopped for a moment, replaced by a chilling, soft voice that sent ice through her veins. "You can't hide forever, Alice." Her heart plummeted. She dropped the phone as if it had burned her, scrambling to her feet. Every nerve in her body screamed to run, but where? Her apartment was supposed to be safe, her retreat from the outside world. But now it felt more like a trap. Frantically, she checked her door lock. It was still secure. She rushed to the windows, making sure they were latched tight. Her pulse raced, and she felt the walls closing in on her. The silence of the apartment was unbearable, amplifying every creak, every whisper of wind against the glass. Her breathing became ragged, her thoughts spiraling into panic. The phone buzzed again. She hesitated before picking it up, her hand trembling. This time it was a message. From the same unknown number. She opened it, and her blood turned to ice. It was a picture of her, sitting on her couch, taken from outside her window. Alice dropped the phone and backed away from the window as though it were poisonous. The blinds were closed, but now she knew he had been outside, watching her. A low buzzing panic rose in her chest. She ran to the door, double-checking the locks. Every window, every possible point of entry was scrutinized. She couldn't breathe. This wasn't a game anymore. He was getting closer, more brazen. With shaking hands, Alice called the police again, her voice barely holding steady as she explained the latest escalation. The dispatcher assured her that a patrol car would be sent to check the area, but the words felt hollow. She had been down this road before. She knew they wouldn't find anything. That night, Alice barely slept. Every sound outside her window jolted her awake. Every gust of wind felt like a threat. She lay in bed, clutching her phone, waiting for another message, another picture, but nothing came. The next morning, exhausted and on edge, she made a decision. She couldn't live like this anymore. She couldn't wait for him to make his move. If the police weren't going to help her, she would have to help herself. Alice started by changing her routine completely. She altered her routes, took different streets, and even parked her car in various locations around her neighborhood. She stopped going out at the same times every day, making herself unpredictable. The feeling of being stalked hung over her like a dark cloud, but she was determined to regain some control over her life. One evening, as the sun set, Alice decided to take matters into her own hands. Armed with a cheap camera she bought earlier that day, she walked out of her apartment, determined to catch her stalker in the act. She felt paranoid, but also desperate. She needed proof, something to show the police that this wasn't just her imagination. As she walked down her street, her heart pounded in her chest, every shadow seeming to hide something sinister. The camera felt heavy in her hands, She kept her eyes peeled for any sign of him, scanning every corner, every figure in the distance. Then, she saw him. He was standing across the street, just out of the light from the street lamp. The same man from the food court, his face obscured by shadow, watching her intently. The hairs on the back of Alice's neck stood on end, but this time, she didn't run. Slowly, she raised the camera, snapping a photo of him. The flash lit up the dark street, and for a brief moment, she saw his face clearly. His expression was cold, detached, as if she were nothing more than a piece of prey. Without a word, he turned and disappeared into the shadows. Alice's breath came in ragged gasps as she clutched the camera to her chest. She had him. She had proof. But as she hurried back to her apartment, her mind raced with a terrifying realization: he hadn't been hiding. He wanted her to see him. Alice hurried back to her apartment, her pulse still racing from the confrontation. The camera felt like a lifeline in her hands, proof that her stalker was real, not just a figment of her imagination. She rushed inside, slamming the door behind her, locking it twice for good measure. Her fingers trembled as she connected the camera to her laptop, ready to upload the picture and show it to the police. But when the image loaded, her heart sank. The photo was completely overexposed, washed out by the camera's flash. His face was nothing more than a blur of light and shadow. No defining features, nothing that would help identify him. A wave of frustration crashed over her. She had been so close. For a moment, she sat in silence, her hands gripping the edge of the desk, her mind swirling in a chaotic storm of fear and anger. What was she supposed to do now? The police wouldn't believe her without solid proof, and now the only evidence she had was useless. Her phone buzzed again. A chill ran down her spine. Another message from the unknown number. She hesitated, her thumb hovering over the screen, before finally opening it. "Nice try. But I see everything." Her breath caught in her throat. She felt like the walls of her apartment were closing in on her. He wasn't just watching, he was taunting her, toying with her. Fear began morphing into something else, something darker. Rage. She couldn't just sit here and wait for him to strike. No. She needed to take control. The next few days, Alice meticulously prepared. She installed security cameras around her apartment, one by the front door, one outside her window, and even a couple of motion-activated sensors inside. She changed her locks, switched her phone number, and blocked all unknown numbers from contacting her. She wasn't going to let him terrorize her any longer. But despite her precautions, the feeling of dread never left. She jumped at every sound, every knock at the door, her nerves wound so tight that she felt like a puppet on strings, ready to snap. The stalker didn't contact her for several days. The silence was almost worse than the messages. The not knowing when or where he would appear next ate away at her. She barely slept, and when she did, it was filled with nightmares of him standing over her bed, watching, waiting. Then, one evening, her phone buzzed again. Her heart sank as she read the message. "You're not safe anywhere. Not even at home." She froze. Her apartment was supposed to be her sanctuary, the one place she could control. But now, even that felt like it had been violated. She frantically checked the security feed on her phone, scanning the footage from her cameras. And there he was, standing just outside her building's entrance, staring directly at the camera. His face was hidden beneath a hood, but his posture was unmistakable. He was daring her, challenging her to do something. Alice's blood ran cold. He was too close. Her hands shook as she dialed the police, her voice barely steady as she explained the situation, begging them to send someone immediately. This time, they took her seriously. Maybe it was the fear in her voice or the urgency of her words, but within minutes, a patrol car arrived outside her building. But when the officers arrived, he was gone. They searched the area, spoke with Alice, and reviewed the footage, but they found nothing. No sign of forced entry, no indication that he had been inside. And yet, Alice couldn't shake the feeling that he was still nearby, watching, waiting for the right moment. That night, she double-checked every lock, every window, and set the motion detectors before crawling into bed. She lay awake, staring at the ceiling, the weight of exhaustion pulling her under. But sleep was elusive, her mind too wired with fear to rest. Then, in the dead of night, the motion sensors went off. Alice jolted awake, her heart pounding in her chest. She reached for her phone, checking the security feed. The camera outside her door showed nothing. She switched to the inside camera, scanning the footage. And then she saw him. Inside her apartment. Her blood turned to ice. He was standing in her living room, just beyond the frame of her bedroom door, motionless, as though waiting for her to notice him. Panic gripped her. How had he gotten in? She had locked everything, checked every point of entry. Her mind raced. She could call the police, but what if he attacked before they arrived? She needed to do something now. Moving as quietly as possible, Alice slipped out of bed, grabbing the heavy flashlight she kept on her nightstand. The weight of it in her hand was comforting, but not enough to calm the terror surging through her veins. Her breathing was shallow as she crept toward the door, her heart pounding so loudly she feared it would give her away. She peered through the crack of the door, her eyes scanning the dimly lit living room. He wasn't there anymore. The space was empty, but the motion sensor had clearly been triggered. Her pulse quickened. Was he hiding? Waiting for her to step out? Steeling herself, Alice pushed the door open, holding the flashlight high. The living room was eerily silent, the shadows playing tricks on her exhausted mind. She stepped forward cautiously, her eyes darting around the room, searching for any sign of him. Then, she felt it, a cold breeze. The window. One of the windows in her kitchen was open, the curtains billowing slightly. She moved toward it, her mind racing. Had he come through there? Was he still in the apartment? Suddenly, she heard a soft creak behind her. She spun around, flashlight raised, her heart hammering in her chest. But the room was empty. Had it been her imagination? Was the fear making her paranoid? She took a shaky breath, her hand trembling as she reached for the window to close it. Then, from the corner of her eye, she saw movement. In the hallway mirror, his reflection stood directly behind her. Alice screamed, spinning around with the flashlight raised high, but the space behind her was empty. Her heart raced as the adrenaline surged through her body, sending a cold sweat down her spine. The reflection in the hallway mirror was still etched in her mind. He had been there, standing right behind her. She was sure of it. But now, the room was silent, save for her own ragged breathing. The kitchen, the living room, all were still. She stood frozen, gripping the flashlight as if it were a lifeline, her eyes darting around the room, searching for any sign of him. Nothing moved, yet she couldn't shake the feeling that he was still watching, lurking just beyond the edges of her vision. She backed away slowly, her mind racing, trying to make sense of the impossible. Had he slipped out through the window? Was he hiding somewhere in the apartment? The tension in the air was suffocating, thick with a sense of dread that made her skin crawl. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, startling her so violently that she almost dropped the flashlight. She fumbled to pull it out, her hands shaking as she stared at the screen. "I'm closer than you think." Her heart sank. He was toying with her, playing a game she didn't understand, but one she was losing. Alice's mind reeled. There had to be a way out, a way to end this nightmare before he made his final move. But what could she do? The police hadn't found anything, and even with the security cameras, he had still managed to invade her home. Suddenly, the lights flickered, casting the room in brief moments of darkness. Alice froze, her eyes widening in terror. The power had never gone out in her building before. She glanced toward the windows, but the streetlights outside were still glowing. It wasn't a neighborhood blackout. It was him. Before she could react, the lights cut out completely, plunging the apartment into total darkness. Panic surged through her. She fumbled with the flashlight, switching it on and casting its narrow beam across the room. The shadows seemed to twist and shift as if mocking her. She stumbled toward the door, her breath coming in rapid gasps as she reached for the doorknob. But it wouldn't budge. The door was locked from the inside, just as she had left it. She twisted the knob violently, pulling and shaking it with all her strength, but it was as if an invisible force held it shut. Her mind raced. She was trapped, locked in her own apartment with him. Then, she heard it, the softest of sounds, like the rustling of fabric. It came from the hallway behind her. Alice slowly turned, the flashlight beam trembling in her hand as she aimed it toward the dark corridor. The hallway seemed to stretch endlessly in the darkness, the faint outline of the mirror at the far end barely visible. She stepped forward, her feet moving on autopilot, driven by equal parts fear and the need for answers. Her pulse pounded in her ears as she reached the threshold of the hallway, her fingers gripping the flashlight so tightly that her knuckles ached. There, in the mirror's reflection, she saw him again. He stood just behind her, his form a shadowy silhouette, barely discernible in the faint light. His face was still obscured, but she could feel his eyes on her, cold and malevolent. He didn't move, didn't speak. He just watched. Alice whipped around, but once again, there was nothing there. She gasped, her breathing erratic as her mind tried to comprehend the impossibility of it all. Her stalker wasn't just some man following her. He was something else, something that defied logic. Her skin prickled as the realization hit her. This wasn't just a game of cat and mouse. He had been inside her mind, invading her reality in ways she couldn't explain. Then, a cold hand closed around her wrist. Alice screamed, the flashlight slipping from her grasp and clattering to the floor. The grip on her wrist tightened, pulling her toward the hallway with inhuman strength. She stumbled, her feet dragging as she struggled against the unseen force. Her breath came in short, panic bursts as she twisted and fought, but the grip was relentless, dragging her toward the darkness. She reached out blindly, her hands finding purchase on the doorframe as she fought with all her might to resist. But it was no use. The force was too strong, too powerful. Her fingers slipped, and she was yanked backward into the black void of the hallway. The apartment fell silent again. Alice's eyes snapped open. She was lying on the cold floor of her living room, disoriented, her heart still pounding from the terror of what had just happened. The lights were back on, the apartment eerily still. For a moment, she wondered if she had blacked out, if everything that had happened had been some sort of waking nightmare. But then she saw it, the door. It was wide open. The once impenetrable door that had held her captive was now ajar, as if inviting her to step outside, to flee from the horror that waited within. Her instincts screamed at her to run, to get out while she still could, but something in her gut told her it wasn't over yet. Alice crawled to her feet, her body aching, her mind buzzing with the lingering sense of dread. She moved slowly toward the door, every muscle in her body tensed, expecting him to appear again, to grab her, to end this nightmare once and for all. But the hallway beyond the door was empty. For a brief moment, Alice allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, he was gone. That whatever had happened in the last few hours had been the climax of his twisted game, and now it was over. But then, her phone buzzed again. With trembling hands, she picked it up and read the message. "Come outside. Let's finish this." Alice's hands trembled as she stared at the message, her heart pounding so loudly it seemed to echo in her skull. The words felt like a noose tightening around her neck. "Come outside." Let's finish this." It wasn't a threat, it was a promise. And despite the bone-chilling fear gnawing at her, something compelled her to act, to end this once and for all. She glanced at the open door. The hallway beyond was bathed in the dim glow of the building's emergency lights, flickering slightly as if uncertain whether to stay lit or plunge into darkness. Alice swallowed hard, her mind racing with thoughts of what might be waiting for her on the other side. Could she really step out, knowing he could be out there, watching her every move? Would she even make it to the elevator? Her phone buzzed again. Another message. "Don't make me wait." A surge of anger flared inside her. This wasn't just fear anymore. It was frustration, rage, the unbearable weight of being hunted. For weeks, she had been a puppet in his twisted game, and now he was pulling the final strings. Her muscles tensed as she realized that running wouldn't solve anything. She needed to confront him to end this madness. Grabbing her phone, Alice made her way to the door, her steps tentative but deliberate. She clutched the phone in one hand and the flashlight in the other, even though she knew its beam would do little against the horrors she'd already faced. Her eyes darted down the hallway, scanning every shadow, every corner for movement. The hallway was still. Too still. She took a deep breath and stepped outside. The moment her foot crossed the threshold, she felt a shift, a presence. It was as though the very air had thickened, wrapping around her like invisible tendrils. She wasn't alone. Suddenly, the sound of footsteps echoed from the far end of the hall. Slow, steady, calculated. Alice's breath caught in her throat as her body went rigid. The man she had seen in the food court, in the mirror, was coming for her. She could hear him approaching, the footsteps unnervingly rhythmic, getting louder with each passing second. Her heart thundered as she backed toward the elevator, her hands shaking so violently that she nearly dropped her phone. As she reached for the button, a cold hand clasped over hers, stopping her in her tracks. She spun around, her scream barely escaping her lips before she was face to face with him. He stood there, tall and imposing, cloaked in shadow, his face still obscured in the dim light of the hallway. There was something wrong about him, something that went beyond human. His eyes, when they met hers, were empty, black pits of nothingness, swallowing any trace of light that dared to enter. He smiled. Not a warm or friendly smile, but a chilling, predatory grin that sent icy tendrils of fear creeping down her spine. "You should have stayed inside," he whispered, his voice a low, guttural rasp that vibrated through her bones. Alice stumbled backward, but he grabbed her arm, his grip like iron. Panic surged through her, her instincts screaming at her to run, to escape. But his strength was overwhelming. She was trapped. "I've waited so long for this," he murmured, pulling her closer. "So long to see the fear in your eyes." Her body convulsed in terror, but something snapped inside her. A surge of defiance broke through the layers of fear that had been smothering her for so long. With all the strength she had left, she swung the flashlight, smashing it against his face. He recoiled, releasing her just long enough for her to break free. Alice bolted down the hallway, her heart racing, adrenaline pushing her legs to move faster than they ever had before. She reached the stairwell, throwing herself through the door and sprinting down the stairs, her breath coming in desperate gasps. Behind her, she heard him moving again. His footsteps weren't panicked, weren't hurried, they were slow, deliberate, and much too close. He was playing with her, letting her run, but she knew he could catch up whenever he wanted. Alice's mind was a whirlwind of panic and confusion. What was he? How had he gotten into her apartment, her life, her mind? She couldn't make sense of it. All she knew was that she had to escape. She burst through the exit door at the bottom of the stairwell and into the cold night air. The mall's parking garage was eerily quiet, only the distant hum of passing cars breaking the silence. Alice's eyes scanned the rows of parked vehicles, desperately searching for her car, but her vision blurred with exhaustion and terror. Then, she heard it again, the slow, deliberate footsteps behind her. She whipped around, expecting to see him just feet away. But the parking lot was empty. No sign of him anywhere. Alice's breathing slowed, her chest heaving as she tried to calm herself. Maybe she had lost him. Maybe this was her chance to get away. She started toward her car, moving quickly but cautiously, constantly glancing over her shoulder. But then, the lights in the parking lot began to flicker. One by one, they went out, plunging the garage into darkness. And there he was, standing between her and her car, his face finally illuminated by the last flickering light. His eyes bore into hers, and for the first time, she saw his face clearly. He wasn't just a man. His skin was ashen, stretched tight over his skeletal features. His mouth twisted into that same cruel grin, his teeth sharp and jagged. Alice froze, her mind screaming at her to run, but her legs refused to move. She was trapped again, and this time, she knew there was no escape. He took a step toward her, and then another, closing the distance between them with terrifying calmness. Alice backed up, her body trembling, her breath shallow. All this time, he whispered, his voice echoing in the vast emptiness of the garage. "You thought you were running from me, but you've been running toward this moment." Alice's back hit the concrete wall behind her, her escape cut off. The predator closed in, his hand reaching out toward her, fingers brushing against her skin. And then everything went black. Alice awoke to the sound of silence. No footsteps. No cold grip. Just the soft hum of the mall's distant generators. Her body was sprawled on the cold, hard floor of the parking garage, her mind trying to pull itself from the fog of unconsciousness. Every inch of her ached, but she was alive. Slowly, painfully, she pushed herself up, her heart hammering in her chest, but there was no sign of him. The stalker was gone. Had he ever truly been there? Her mind raced as she glanced around the dimly lit garage. It was empty, save for the rows of parked cars and the distant echoes of the city. Alice's pulse pounded in her ears as she tried to steady her breath. She blacked out, but for how long? The edges of her memories blurred, flashes of his skeletal face and those black, empty eyes burning in her mind. Yet now, there was only stillness. Staggering to her feet, Alice reached for her phone, her fingers trembling. The screen was cracked, but it still lit up with a message notification. Her stomach twisted as she unlocked it. The message read, "You can't run from what's inside you." Her heart skipped a beat. That same sinking feeling of dread returned, pressing down on her chest like a weight she couldn't shake off. Alice's vision blurred as she stared at the phone. She'd been running, fighting, hiding from him, this monstrous figure, but what if he wasn't chasing her? What if the stalker had never been a man, but something far more insidious? A sickening realization clawed its way into her mind. The dread, the sensation of being watched, followed. It had started long before the food court, long before the mall. It was something that had been growing inside her, a shadow in her own psyche. Every time she'd seen him, she'd been alone. No one else had ever noticed. No one else had ever seen. She looked around the empty garage again, this time with new eyes. There was no one there because there never had been. The stalker wasn't real. Or rather, he was real enough, a twisted manifestation of her deepest fears, her paranoia, her loneliness, brought to life by the dark corners of her mind. And now that she knew, now that she understood, there was no more running. Alice dropped her phone, its screen flickering as it hit the pavement with a clatter. Her legs felt weak, her body hollow, but her mind, for the first time in weeks, was clear. She had to stop fighting it. She had to face him, face herself. Slowly, she turned to the spot where she had last seen him. Her heart raced, but this time, she didn't feel like prey. She stepped forward, and as she did, the darkness of the parking garage seemed to deepen. The shadows pulled together in front of her, slowly forming into the shape of the stalker once more. There he stood, his eyes black as ever, his grin twisted and predatory. But now Alice saw him for what he truly was. He wasn't human. He was fear, paranoia, and everything that had gnawed away at her, piece by piece. "You're not real," she whispered, her voice shaking but determined. The stalker cocked his head, that grin widening. "Real enough for you to run," he hissed, his voice slithering through the air like smoke. Alice felt a surge of anger rising in her chest. How many nights had she been tormented by this thing? How many times had she looked over her shoulder, waiting for him to appear? And for what? He was a shadow, an illusion. He had no power except the power she gave him. "You don't control me anymore," Alice said, louder this time. "I'm not running from you." For a moment, the stalker's grin faltered. His eyes flashed, a flicker of something almost human, surprise, maybe even fear. The two of them stood there, locked in a silent battle, until, with a final blink, the figure of the stalker began to dissolve, fading into the shadows of the garage. Alice stood alone once more. The oppressive weight in the air lifted, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she could breathe. The fear, the paranoia, it wasn't gone, but it no longer controlled her. She had faced it. She had survived. The parking lot lights flickered back to life, casting the garage in a pale, artificial glow. Everything looked normal now. Just another late night, just another empty parking garage. The kind of place she wouldn't give a second thought to anymore. With slow, steady steps, Alice made her way to her car, the world around her strangely calm. She didn't look back as she slid into the driver's seat and turned the key in the ignition. The engine hummed to life, and she drove off into the night, leaving the mall, the stalker, and that dark chapter of her life behind. But as she turned onto the empty highway, her phone buzzed again. She glanced down at the screen, her breath catching in her throat. One last message, "I'll be waiting." Alice's hand clenched around the wheel, but this time, she wasn't afraid. This time, she knew she was stronger.